of transporting that fuel, and that's by pipeline. That's how our major volumes of fuels are transported in this country right now. So, you know, the question, I think you mentioned our environment. We're in a grip right now. What do we have, 2 minutes?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
We're in a grip right now of, and listen, I grew up in the 1970s. I was there for the first Earth Day. So I'm an environmentalist. I'm a marine biologist, or at least I had most of my career at marine biology laboratories. I love the environment. I turn off lights when I leave the room, and I believe in conserving energy. Right? This is all part of being an environmentalist. But we're in the grip of an element that is a little bit overzealous in their embracing of the environment. To the expense of our economy and the welfare and the well-being of our citizens. And whether or not they understand it or pretend not to understand it, at the very expense of the environment they're trying to protect. So the answer to your question is, yes, I support the rapid completion of the Keystone Pipeline.
Thank you. Mr. Chapman, your response to the same question.
I also support the Keystone Pipeline. And like Mark mentioned, it's economic issues, and it's an opportunity to provide jobs for people in this country. I'm also a supporter of promoting green energy and clean energy. I think what we should do in this country with regard to energy and getting more of it here, we need to focus our issues on more energy independence. That's sort of the guiding principle that I have. And we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, oil and coal. So yes, I support it.
Thank you. Mr. Coggiano.
There are pipelines everywhere. You may not know it, you may not see them because pipelines as a rule are underground. They don't cause too many problems. This one has been studied more than any other pipeline in the history of pipelines. It will create 42,000 jobs is the estimate, and if I'm not mistaken, John Kerry might even be for it. He may not be. It depends if he was for it before and later on he wasn't. But his is one of the final decisions. It's safe, it'll create jobs, it will help our economy. Build it now.
I think we've run the table here, swept it here. I support the Keystone Pipeline also, and I think that it's certainly good for the economy. There's no question about that. But there's also, we have to, I think, take an approach where we derive energy from a lot of different places, and we have to be pragmatic about where we get those energy sources. We also have to think about the way that technology can spur economic growth. I know this, I'm an engineer, I worked with high-tech companies. New tech, high tech, spurs economic growth, creates jobs, builds businesses, creates jobs. And so I think we have to be comprehensive with how we look at energy and not be so obsessed with environmental protection. I think environmental protection is very, very important, extremely important. And especially in this district, we have beautiful coastlines, and we have to preserve the environment. There's no question about that. But we also have to be practical about how we derive that energy. That energy and what kind of technologies we invest in for the future. And so I support the Keystone Pipeline. I also support other energy sources that are derived from high tech and that will create jobs for our economy.
Mrs. Barrett will ask the next question directed initially to Mr. Chapman.
Mr. Chapman. During the hearings about the Benghazi scandal, Hillary Clinton asked, "What difference does it make?" when referring to how and why Americans were killed. It appears Congressman Keating was silent on this statement made by Mrs. Clinton. Do you believe Mr. Keating was correct to remain silent? If not, what would you have done if a member of Congress?
Well, first, when it comes to national security issues, I believe that we live in the greatest country in the world, and a country for values, that we have values and a country worth protecting. Unfortunately, like we had overseas in Benghazi, although we're a strong and good nation, there are people and nations around us that just don't like us. So beyond our borders, I'm really concerned with our diminishing influence in the world. And we have radical jihadists as well as the folks in Benghazi who want to cause a collapse of our country and our way of life and what we believe. Even on our own soil, the Boston Marathon is a good example. Government has no higher duty than to keep our citizens safe, whether they're in this country or outside of it. So what we have with the Obama administration is we have a philosophy that's unclear, it's weak, and it's misdirected. And I know we can do better. I would not have remained silent because at those hearings, we owe it to every citizen of this country to stand up and speak when they can.
Mr. Cogliano.
Thank you. The first line of defense in national security is diplomacy. And this State Department failed in so many ways in their, not only the diplomatic mission, but in terms of protecting our people in that embassy who had called for help, who had said that they didn't feel secure there. The Secretary and others in the department did nothing. To me, that's the bigger failure, and that's where, if I was a congressman, I would have stood up and said something. Because this was entirely preventable. And if, as a policy of national security, your diplomacy is failing, that's your first line of defense. There's not much else after that. I'd sure like to see what Leon Panetta has to say about it. He's never testified, and he's the one who can tell us for certain whether or not those jets could have been scrambled from, what was it, 90 miles away? So yes, I would have said on many levels that this is a problem and it needs to be addressed, and I'm so unhappy and angry that it hasn't been addressed by the media and not strongly enough by Congress.
Mr. Choris?
Would you mind repeating the question? I just want to make sure I have the full measure of it.
Great.
Certainly. Okay. During the hearings about the Benghazi scandal, Hillary Clinton asked, "What difference does it make?" when referring to how and why Americans were killed. It appears Congressman Keating was silent on this statement made by Mrs. Clinton. Do you believe Mr. Keating was correct to remain silent? If not, what would you have done if a member of Congress?
No, and if I were in Congress, I would have been the loudest voice there. And I'll say this: what happened with Ambassador Stevens? Ambassador Stevens was one of ours. Where's that investigation? I seem to remember. I'm actually old enough to remember the Iranian hostage crisis, and to see day after day the countdown in the media because our citizens were being held captive in Iran against their will. That was a national attention, that was a national tragedy, and they came home when President Reagan became president. And that was a victory for us. And to have the administration hide the facts about this ambassador, to what happened for a political reason, it's an absolute disgrace.
Mr. Allegro.
I'm going to have something to say about Mr. Keating's silence on a number of issues later. But this also illustrates exactly what I was saying in my open statement. People are disgusted and sick and tired of asking questions and not receiving answers. Now, your question was, what would I have done if I was in that room with Mrs. Clinton and she said, "What does it matter?" The first thing I would have done would have been to hammer her. I would have hammered her until she answered that question. And the second thing I would have done would have been to not leave that room until I had my answers. The Capitol Guards would have had to drag me out by the ankles. We still don't know where the president was for those critical hours that night. I would have explained to Mrs. Clinton, why does it matter, Mrs. Clinton? It matters so that it doesn't happen again. That's why the last time mattered, because we're supposed to be learning from our mistakes. Let's hope that we all learn from our mistakes in the next round of elections.
Thank you. The next question will be from Mr. Perini to Mr. Cogliano.
Mr. Cogliano, if you could have lunch with any one person, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
That's a tough one. There are so many people in history that are would be so interesting to sit down and speak to. But for me, you think of George Washington, would you love to sit down with him, or Abraham Lincoln, who went through the Civil War, one of the toughest presidencies in history. But for me, one of the most interesting people to me in history is Alexander Hamilton. Very quietly and ignored so much by the history books, Alexander Hamilton was so responsible for helping George Washington in the American Revolution by bringing in money, by finding ways to pay the troops or keep them in place, by being counsel to George Washington. He started a central banking system in America. He did so many things and was just such an interesting person, the ups and downs in his life, the times he came back from very tough situations, which all of us have had to do at one time or another, and that's the measure of a person, is whether or not they can get up again and become productive. And he was a person who could. I admire him greatly, and I'd love to sit down and talk with him for a while.
Mr. Shores?
I'd like to, as Vince said, I'd like to, there are tons of historical figures, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Ronald Reagan, that it would be an absolute pleasure to sit down and learn from them. But the American that comes to mind, limiting it to Americans, the American that comes to mind is Mark Twain. And I believe he was one of the most original, unique figures in our history. He was born when Halley's Comet was charging through the sky, and he died as Halley's Comet was going through the sky. He had a very, very interesting life, and I really love his writing. And so he was a very funny man. He did a lot of, he would go on the lecture circuit. He got into debt so bad that he spent all the money from the books that he wrote. He had to go on the lecture circuit, and the lecture circuit was literally going to town by town and giving these, it was like a stand-up comedy act where he would, give his little spiel, and he got such a command over the audience that there was one event where he was there and he walked out on stage and he didn't say a word, and it was silence, and then you heard a laugh over here and a laugh over here, and everyone laughed, and that's when he knew he was with the audience and everything. He's a very unique guy. I'd love to spend some time with him.
Yep. Mark?
The American or Americans that I would give anything to sit down with are my mother and father. When you're a kid and you have wonderful parents, you understand how hard they worked. Well, you don't understand. You get hints and tidbits about it, but you don't really understand it. When you grow older and you have to work hard yourself, you appreciate the things that they did. My folks weren't blue bloods. They struggled to put food on the table. They didn't have the luxury of graduating from high school like so many of us do today. They had to drop out and they had to work to help support their families during the Depression. Spoke to my mom and dad a lot. We had a wonderful relationship. I'd love to speak to my father about his experiences in the war. He spent 3 years in the Pacific on a 110-foot wooden-hulled subchaser. Can't imagine it. 3 years in all of those islands. Not just a couple, all of them. I'm not going to spew them again, because that's part of my regular little speech. My mother, who dropped out of high school at the age of 14 and lied about her age so that she can work in a teapot factory to help support the family. I'd like to ask her, now as an adult, what it was like, Mom. What was it like for you to make sure that you put clothes on our back, food on the table, and a roof over our head? Those are the Americans that I would give anything to speak to right now.
John?
Mark, I had someone in mind, and I agree with you about my mother and father. That was very nice. I'd like to have them here too. But to answer the question in this form, and who I'm thinking about, who I'd like to have lunch with, reconnect with, is my first boss and my political mentor, Ronald Reagan. He is a man of integrity and a man of character. He didn't compromise any conservative values, but he worked on a bipartisan basis, and things got done in Washington. He's the only Republican, and this is something we'd like to see more in Massachusetts, who actually, the only recent history Republican president who won an election in Massachusetts twice. And right now, about now, I'd like to have his oratory skills